Amelie's days began before the first rooster crowed, in a small mud-brick hut at the edge of the village where the grassland met the river. The air was always cool in the early morning, heavy with mist that curled over the tall reeds and drifted lazily toward the horizon. She would rise quietly so as not to wake her mother, tiptoeing across the woven mat floor and slipping outside to fetch water from the river. The path was familiar, worn by generations of footsteps, yet it felt different each day with the shifting colors of dawn. Some mornings the sky was soft and pale, like it had been washed in milk. Other mornings it burned with streaks of orange and red, promising heat before the sun had even cleared the trees. Her hands were strong from carrying the heavy clay pot, and her back had grown used to the slight stoop the task demanded. She had been doing it since she was old enough to lift more than a gourd. Amelie never complained. She had learned early that work was not a burden but a duty, something that kept the household alive, that brought food to the pot and water to the fire. Her mother often told her, "Child, the river will not come to us, we must go to it." But it wasn't the physical labor that made Amelie feel small. It was the words, sharp as thorns, that followed her like a shadow wherever she went. The children in the village would snicker when she spoke, mimicking the way her tongue sometimes caught on a syllable. To say it again, Amelie, they'd tease and she would force a smile, pretending it didn't hurt. Even the adults, though less cruel, sometimes looked at her with pity, their eyes soft but their lips pursed as if they had already decided she would never be anything more than the quiet, stammering girl from the riverside. Amelie had learned to keep her sentences short. The fewer words she said, the fewer chances for her voice to betray her. She spoke mostly to her mother, whose patience never wavered. Her mother, Nombula, was a woman with a spine as straight as a spear and hands that could coax a harvest from even the stingiest soil. When others mocked Amelie, Nombula's eyes would flash like lightning. Amelie was in the middle of pounding maize when she first heard the drums. The rhythmic thump echoed over the hills, carried on the wind from the main road. It was not the casual drumming of children playing in the sun, nor the ceremonial beats of a wedding. This was the deep, deliberate cadence of the king's messengers, a sound that could freeze a village in place. Her hand stilled over the mortar, the heavy pestle resting against her hip. She looked toward the road, heart tightening. Her mother, who had been sorting beans nearby, raised her head sharply. "Amelie, do you hear that?" she whispered. Amelie nodded, her lips pressing together. Everyone knew what those drums meant. The messengers were close and they did not travel without purpose. They came for matters of great importance, to summon witnesses for royal judgments, to announce decrees, to collect tributes, and sometimes, to bring accusations. The children were the first to run to the road, bare feet kicking up dust. The women and old men followed, curiosity pulling them like strings. Amelie's mother grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "Stay by me," she murmured, though her eyes betrayed her own unease. When the king's riders appeared, their presence seemed to swallow the road. They were tall men, cloaked in the deep red and gold of the royal colors, their spears catching the sunlight. The lead rider bore the carved staff of summons, a smooth, polished wood capped with a bronze head in the shape of the lion, the king's symbol. The drummers walked behind, their hands striking stretched goat skin with unerring precision. The entire village went quiet. Even the goats stopped bleating, their heads turned toward the riders as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. The lead messenger's eyes swept over the gathering crowd. He dismounted, his leather sandals thudding against the ground. Then, in a voice that carried like the cry of a hunting bird, he spoke. "Amelie, daughter of Kasai, step forward." Amelie's breath caught in her chest. She froze, her fingers tightening on the edge of her skirt. Her stutter made her shy before strangers. Standing in front of the king's men felt like a nightmare turned real. Her mother's hand squeezed hers reassuringly, then gave her a small push. "Go, my child," she urged softly. She stepped forward slowly, aware of every pair of eyes on her. The messenger reached into the leather pouch at his side and withdrew a rolled piece of parchment, sealed with the royal emblem pressed into wax. He held it high for all to see before breaking the seal. "Amelie, daughter of Kasai," he intoned, "by order of His Majesty King Sephu, you are hereby summoned to appear before the royal court on the 3rd day from now. The matter is one of importance to the kingdom, and your presence is required under law. Failure to attend will be considered defiance against the crown." A ripple of whispers moved through the villagers. Amelie's palms grew damp. She could feel their stares burrowing into her, curious, pitying, suspicious. "What has she done?" someone murmured from the crowd. "Perhaps it is about her family's land," another guessed. "No," an older woman's voice said. "I heard she spoke against the noble's son when they met in the market." Amelie lowered her gaze, wishing she could vanish. The messenger stepped closer, holding out the parchment. She accepted it with trembling hands, her eyes flicking over the neat script she could barely read. The messenger's gaze lingered on her for a moment as though trying to read her soul, then he stepped back. "You will be escorted to the capital in 2 days' time. Prepare yourself." The riders remounted, the drumming resumed, and within moments the royal party was gone, leaving only dust and murmurs in their wake. Her mother slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Do not listen to them," she whispered fiercely. "The king's call may yet be a blessing." But Amelie's mind churned. She had done nothing to draw the king's notice, at least nothing she could think of. She kept her head down, spoke little, worked hard. Why now? Why her? The rest of the day she felt the weight of the village's eyes wherever she went. At the well, the women paused their chatter when she arrived. In the market, whispers floated after her like dry leaves. A group of boys passed by and one of them made an exaggerated stuttering sound, earning a sharp slap from an elder, but the sting of it landed in her heart. That evening her closest friend, Zola, came to her home. Zola's dark eyes were wide with curiosity. "Amelie, do you know why they want you?" She shook her head, clutching her knees as they sat under the fading light. Zola leaned closer, voice low. "Some think it is about the king's son. Others think it has to do with the cursed stone in the river. But my uncle, he says the king has been looking for someone. A girl with a gift." Amelie laughed softly, without humor. "My only gift is tripping over my own tongue." Zola's expression softened. "That's what they think. But maybe the king knows something they don't." The next day was filled with preparations. Her mother washed and mended her best dress, a deep blue one she wore only for harvest festivals. They gathered small offerings for the journey, dried meat, ground maize, and a pouch of water. Neighbors came under the guise of offering advice, but most simply wanted to see her up close, to examine the girl who had caught the king's notice. That night, Amelie couldn't sleep. She lay on her mat, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of the wind. Her mind replayed the messenger's voice, the weight of the parchment, the eyes of the entire village. She imagined walking into the royal court, her stutter echoing off the grand walls, the nobles smirking. Shame burned her cheeks even in the dark. But somewhere, buried deep under the fear, a small ember of curiosity flickered. What if this was more than just a summons? What if it was a chance to be seen for something other than her stutter? The morning of the journey came with the crowing of the rooster. The messengers returned, this time with 2 more men to escort her. She hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the scent of smoke and earth that clung to her clothes. "Remember, Amelie," her mother said, her voice thick. "Walk with your head high. Whatever awaits you, you are more than they think you are." The villagers gathered again to watch her departure. Some looked on with curiosity, others with envy, a few with open suspicion. The boys who had mocked her before now stood silent, their eyes darting between her and the royal guards. As the party began to move, Amelie glanced back one last time. Her mother stood at the edge of the road, hands clasped tightly, her face unreadable. Zola waved from beside her, mouthing words Amelie couldn't hear but knew in her heart. Be brave. They left the familiar hills behind, the road stretching ahead toward the unknown. With each step, the village faded into memory and the capital, with all its dangers and possibilities, drew closer. And though her heart still beat fast, Amelie felt that ember inside her flare just a little brighter. The grand court hall loomed before Amelie like a mountain she had no choice but to climb. Its towering wooden doors were carved with stories of kings long dead, battles fought under red skies, and treaties sealed with blood. Sunlight spilled in from the high windows, making the polished floor gleam. Her heart thumped so hard she felt as if the entire kingdom could hear it. Every step she took echoed, drawing the gaze of hundreds of eyes that did not see her as a simple village girl, but as prey. The room was alive with murmurs. Nobles in fine robes stood beside warriors whose armor clinked with every shift of their weight. The air smelled of incense and power. Amelie's palms were damp, and she clutched the edge of her simple shawl as if it could shield her from the sharpness of their stares. She had always known her stutter was a weakness in the eyes of others, but here, under the vaulted ceiling of the king's court, it felt like a curse. As she stepped forward, she caught the first whisper. "Is that the girl from the river village?" a merchant murmured to his wife. "The one who can't speak without chewing her own tongue?" the woman replied, failing to suppress her laughter. The sound burned in Amelie's ears. She kept her eyes low, willing her feet to keep moving. At the far side of the hall, just beneath the golden dais where the king's throne sat, a cluster of young court ladies huddled together like brightly dressed birds. Their silks shimmered with threads of gold and silver, their wrists heavy with beads that chimed when they moved. One of them, tall with hair braided into a crown, leaned toward another and whispered loudly enough for Amelie to hear. "Careful, if you ask her name, you'll be waiting until the moon rises for the answer." Laughter rippled through their group, sharp and cold. Amelie's breath caught, but she forced herself forward. Every step felt like walking deeper into a fire. The court ladies' eyes followed her, their smirks growing bolder. Another voice piped up. Maybe the king called her to teach the royal parrots how to speak, slowly. The joke earned a round of giggles and a few curious glances from the crowd. One lady, perhaps emboldened by the safety of her companions, took a deliberate step into Amelie's path. "Good morning," she said, dragging the syllables in cruel imitation. "Did you find the palace without getting lost in your own words?" The cruelty struck like a slap, and the laughter that followed was like salt in the wound. The sound swelled, drawing even more eyes to Amelie's humiliation. Her throat tightened, and her instinct was to turn and run, to leave this place and never return. But the image of her mother's face flashed in her mind. Her mother who had raised her alone, who always told her, "You are more than your voice." Amelie's lips trembled, but she lifted her chin. She didn't reply, her voice would not obey her if she tried, but her silence was not submission. It was the silence of a bow pulled back, storing power. Even so, the sting of their mockery burrowed deep. She felt the weight of every whisper, every smirk, every sideways glance. The court was not a place of justice today, it was a stage and she had been made the fool. From the dais, the king's advisor cleared his throat sharply, calling the room to order. But the damage had been done. Amelie stood in the center of the hall, the echo of their laughter still ringing in her ears, and she understood something. Whatever reason she had been summoned here, she would not leave the same. Something inside her had shifted. And though they could not see it, the laughter had planted a seed, not of shame but of something far more dangerous. Amelie's knees felt weak as she stood in the center of the great court, the stone floor cold beneath her bare feet. The carved pillars around her rose high into the vaulted ceiling, each etched with the faces of long-dead kings watching silently. The court smelled of palm oil torches, dust, and the faint sweetness of incense drifting from the royal altar at the far end. But none of that eased the tightness in her chest, for the man standing opposite her was not just anyone from the village. He was Mandla Komu, the wealthiest merchant in the region, a man whose word could sway even the most stubborn elder. The king sat on his high carved throne, draped in a leopard skin cloak. Around him were his advisors, the elders, the royal guards with their spears, and the whispering crowd that had gathered for the trial. The atmosphere was heavy, tense, like the air before a summer storm. "Amelie, daughter of Nandi," the chief herald's voice rang out, "you stand accused of using witchcraft to bring ruin upon the household of Mandla Komu." Gasps rippled through the audience. Witchcraft was not a light matter here. In the kingdom of Kwanlovu, such an accusation could lead to banishment, imprisonment, or death, and in the worst cases, execution without trial if the king believed the evidence was strong. Amelie's mouth went dry. I have done nothing wrong," she tried to say, but her stutter twisted the words. The crowd erupted in murmurs. A few laughed under their breath and she heard someone say, "Even her tongue can't speak straight, how could her heart?" Mandla stepped forward. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a belly that showed his wealth. His robe was embroidered with gold thread, and heavy ivory bracelets clinked on his wrists. He pointed a finger at her, his rings glinting in the torchlight. "3 moons ago," he began, his deep voice carrying across the court, "my family's harvest was strong. The yam fields were green and heavy, the maize tall and plentiful. But then this girl," he jabbed his finger at her again, "passed by my land one morning, muttering under her breath. She looked at my crops with those strange eyes of hers, her lips trembling with broken words. The next day the yams began to rot. The maize stalks turned yellow. And my wife fell ill with a fever that will not leave her." He turned to face the king. "What else could it be, your majesty? This is no coincidence. Her stuttering is not a sickness, it is the sign of a cursed tongue." A low hum of agreement rose from some in the crowd. Fear had a way of multiplying quickly. A few women covered their children's eyes, as if merely looking at Amelie might invite misfortune. Amelie's heart pounded. She wanted to shout, to defend herself clearly, but the weight of so many eyes on her made her words stumble even more. I was going to the River that day," she began, "and not to curse and not to—" But Mandla cut her off with a mocking laugh. Listen to her. She can barely say her own name. Yet she expects us to believe she has control over her tongue? If she cannot speak to people, perhaps she speaks to the spirits instead. The court ladies who had mocked her earlier tittered behind their jeweled fans. One of them leaned to another and whispered loudly enough for all to hear, "Maybe the spirits stutter too." A wave of shame burned through Amelie, but she lifted her chin. "Your Majesty, I swear before the spirits of my ancestors, I have never cursed anyone. I only speak as the Creator made me." An old court elder, with skin dark and wrinkled as dried fruit, leaned on his staff and addressed the king. "Sire, we must remember, words have power in our land. The tongue can bless or destroy. If her speech is broken, perhaps it breaks the fortune of others." Manla seized on the elder's words. "Yes. You see, even the wise agree. This is dangerous. My family's suffering is proof enough." But the king did not respond immediately. His sharp eyes studied Amelie, then shifted to Mandla. "You claim she brought misfortune upon you. But where is your proof beyond what your eyes have seen?" "My proof," Mandla said, his voice growing more forceful, "is in the earth itself. Ask any farmer in the western fields, they will tell you how quickly my land turned sour after her visit. Ask the healer, he will tell you my wife's sickness began the same day. And ask the spirits, they will not lie." At the mention of consulting the spirits, a ripple of unease went through the court. To call for a spiritual test was serious. It meant the accused would be made to undergo rituals that could end in death if the ancestors judged them guilty. Amelie's mother, Nandi, who had been standing at the back of the hall, suddenly stepped forward. Her headscarf was tied tight, her eyes blazing. "Mandla Komu," she said, her voice trembling with anger, "my daughter's stutter is not a curse. It is the gift of life she was born with. You lost your harvest because you grow greedy, planting too much on soil that needed rest. Your wife is ill because even the wealthy fall sick. But to blame her for your misfortunes is cowardice." The guards moved to block Nandi, but the king raised a hand. "Let her speak." Nandi took a deep breath. "If you must test her, then test her. But know this, the truth will shame those who lie." Manla's lips curled into a smug smile. "Then let us test her, Your Majesty." The king's voice was calm but cold. "Very well. At dawn, the ritual of truth will be performed. If she is guilty, the ancestors will show us. If she is innocent, the shame will fall upon the accuser." The court erupted in whispers. Some sounded eager. The ritual of truth was rare and dangerous. Others looked uneasy, for they knew such ceremonies sometimes claimed innocent lives. Amelie felt her stomach twist. She had heard of the ritual since childhood. A test where the accused would be made to drink from the calabash of bitter herbs, their body observed for signs from the spirits. If they vomited or convulsed, it was taken as proof of guilt. If they survived the day unharmed, they were declared innocent, though the herbs themselves could kill the weak. As the guards led her away from the court to await dawn, she caught sight of Mandla's satisfied expression. He believed he had already won. But deep in her chest, beneath the fear, a spark of determination began to burn. She would face this test and she would live. For she knew the truth, her voice, though imperfect, was not cursed. And if the ancestors truly listened, they would hear her heart even if her tongue stumbled. The murmurs of the court had grown quieter, but not out of respect. It was the kind of hush that comes before a storm, when everyone leans forward to watch the lightning strike. The merchant who had accused Amelie still stood with his arms folded, his gold rings flashing under the torchlight. His smug smile told her he believed the outcome was already decided. In this court, money often spoke louder than truth. Amelie's hands trembled. She stared at the polished stone floor, her voice trapped in the cage of her throat. Every time she tried to speak, the familiar blockage pressed against her chest like a stubborn stone. She knew if she opened her mouth now, the words would spill out in pieces, jagged and broken. And here, in front of all these watching eyes, those broken words could be twisted into the very proof of witchcraft her accuser wanted. From the back of the hall, movement caught her eye. Her mother had pushed through the crowd, ignoring the sharp looks from guards and the disapproving murmurs of nobles. She moved like a woman who had already decided she would not be stopped, her faded head wrap slightly crooked, her bare feet silent against the cool stone. "Amelie," her mother called softly, her voice trembling, yet holding a weight that cut through the air like a spear. The guards allowed her forward, perhaps out of pity, perhaps because they knew this moment would change nothing. When her mother reached her, she placed both hands on Amelie's face, cupping her cheeks the way she had done since Amelie was a child afraid of the dark. The smell of home, smoke from their cooking fire, the faint scent of dried herbs, washed over Amelie, grounding her in the middle of this cruel arena. Without a word, her mother slipped her hand into the folds of her wrapper and drew out a small charm. It was simple, a piece of smooth river stone wrapped in red and gold thread, with 3 tiny cowrie shells tied at the top. Amelie recognized it immediately. It had hung above their doorway since before she could remember, a protection charm passed down through generations. Her mother pressed it into her palm, closing Amelie's fingers around it until the edges dug gently into her skin. "This is from your grandmother's hands," her mother whispered, leaning so close that Amelie could feel the warmth of her breath. "She carried it the day she faced the council of chiefs who wanted to take our land. She walked in afraid, but she walked out with the truth on her side and the land still ours. Today you will do the same." Amelie's lips quivered. "Ma." The first sound caught, the second stumbled. Her mother didn't flinch. "Do not fear the breaking of your words," she murmured. "Even a drum with a crack can carry a message the ancestors will hear. Speak with the heart, not with the tongue. Let them hear what they are too blind to see." The merchant scoffed loudly from across the room. "Are we to allow charms and whispers in a trial? This is nothing but witchcraft again." His words rippled through the crowd, some gasping in false shock, others laughing. Amelie's mother turned her head slowly toward him. "You call every power you do not understand witchcraft," she said, her voice low but steady. "Perhaps that is why your heart is so small. You fear what you cannot control." Gasps rose from the audience, but the guards did not move. The king's eyes, shadowed beneath his beaded crown, were fixed on the old woman. Her mother ignored the stares and turned back to Amelie. She placed her forehead against her daughter's, a gesture as old as the blood in their veins, and began to murmur. It was not just a prayer, it was a weaving. The words wound around Amelie like invisible cloth, each phrase tightening her spine, each syllable pushing away the weight on her chest. The language was old, older than the court, older than the king himself. Amelie could not understand every word, but she knew their meaning by the way they sank into her bones. Asterisk. You are the granddaughter of women who did not kneel. You are the voice of rivers that do not stop flowing. You are the breath of the first fire, the keeper of the last ember. Stand, child. Stand. Asterisk. Amelie's fingers tightened around the charm. She felt its warmth grow, not like the heat of the sun but like the steady pulse of something alive. And then she realized the warmth wasn't coming from the charm alone. It was rising from deep within her chest. The sensation was strange, almost unsettling, as though her ribs had become hollow and something powerful was swirling inside them. Her throat tingled. The blockage that had been there all her life felt different. It wasn't gone, but it no longer pressed against her like an enemy. Instead, it pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, as if waiting for the right moment to open. Her mother stepped back, her eyes glistening. "When they ask you to speak, do not force it. Let it come when it is ready. Your voice will know the time." The judge called for silence. The court's attention snapped back to Amelie. The king leaned forward. "Girl," he said, his deep voice echoing, "you have been accused of cursing the merchant's harvest. Speak your truth now. The court will hear you." 1,000 eyes bore into her. She could hear the whispers already starting in the corners of the room, mockery, doubt, the sharpening of knives in people's minds. Amelie's heart pounded, but she remembered her mother's words. She closed her eyes and drew in a slow breath. The charm in her hand seemed to pulse once more, and she felt that swirling force in her chest gathering, like clouds before rain. She opened her mouth. The first sound was soft, but it did not break. The second came stronger, carrying with it something that did not belong to her alone. It was as if her ancestors had leaned close, their voices pouring through her like wind through reeds. The court fell silent, not out of courtesy but because something in her voice held them still. Even those who had mocked her before sat frozen, their cruel smiles fading. Amelie spoke, not perfectly, not smoothly, but with a power that made every stutter sound like the beat of a drum. And though she could not yet see the full shape of it, she knew this was only the beginning of what her voice was about to become. The chief judge's voice rang through the court, sharp and deliberate, echoing off the carved wooden pillars. "Amelie," he said, his tone soaked in condescension, "you stand here accused of dark words and mischief. The king demands your defense. Speak, if you can." The phrase "if you can" lingered in the air like a cruel thorn. The court erupted in laughter. Some of the nobles leaned forward on their benches, eager to see the spectacle. A few covered their mouths, pretending to hide their amusement, but their eyes sparkled with the pleasure of watching humiliation unfold. Even the guards at the entrance shifted, not from discomfort but from anticipation. Amelie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat heavy enough to feel in her ears. Her palms were damp. The room felt smaller and louder all at once, filled with the low murmur of whispers and the faint jingle of ornaments from the court lady's braids. Every face seemed turned toward her, every gaze like a spear. She could see the merchant who had accused her standing smugly near the front, arms crossed, lips twisted in a faint smile that dared her to fail. She opened her mouth to speak, but her tongue caught. The first syllable wobbled on her lips. I. The laughter grew louder, feeding on itself. The chief judge leaned back, a satisfied grin on his face. The court sees for itself, he said mockingly. How can such broken words hold truth? Perhaps the brokenness hides the poison in them. A small group of young warriors in the corner chuckled openly, tapping one another on the shoulder as though they were watching a street performance. The court ladies in silk skirts whispered and giggled behind their beaded fans. One even mimicked Amelie's stutter in a high, exaggerated voice, making those nearby laugh harder. Amelie's fingers curled into fists at her side. She could feel her mother's charm in her pocket, the smooth beads warm from being held earlier. She wanted to reach for it now to feel its comfort, but she feared the court would take the gesture as a sign of guilt. The king, seated on his elevated throne, did not laugh. His dark, unreadable eyes remained fixed on her, his expression neither kind nor cruel. But his stillness made her more uneasy. She could not tell if his silence meant he was weighing her fate or simply enjoying the scene. Amelie, the judge pressed, his voice tightening, your life may rest on your answer. Tell the court, did you curse this man's harvest? She swallowed hard. No, she managed, the single word shattering in her throat like fragile glass. The crowd howled. The judge raised a hand to silence them, though the smirk never left his face. And can you prove it? Her mind scrambled for an answer. She thought of the merchant's fields, of the rains that had come late, of the insects that had swarmed across the land. Everyone had seen these things. Everyone knew they were not the work of one woman's tongue. But here logic was drowned beneath pride, prejudice, and the desire for a spectacle. Amelie's breath quickened. She felt as though she were drowning in the weight of their stares. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the shame, beneath the trembling, a spark began to stir, small but steady. The judge tilted his head mockingly. We are waiting. Perhaps you can summon your magic to untangle your words. The laughter returned, rolling like a wave through the court. And in that moment, Amelie understood something. They were not simply testing her innocence. They were testing her existence. Her chest tightened. She could feel her voice, fragile, hesitant, pressing against the inside of her throat, wanting to come out not in stutters, but in something else entirely. She closed her eyes briefly, just enough to steady herself, just enough to hear her mother's whispered prayer in her memory. When she opened them, the hall seemed quieter, though the mocking faces were still there. She knew she would have to speak again, no matter how the words came out. The court fell silent the instant Amelie's lips parted. 4 hours she had been mocked, her stammer ridiculed, her pauses filled with laughter, her every attempt to speak cut short by jeers. The chief judge's smirk still lingered in the air, as though he believed he had already won, as though her humiliation was complete. But the sound that emerged from Amelie's throat was not the sound anyone expected. It was deep. It was steady. It was ancient. Amelie, her voice said, though it was not her voice at all. It rolled through the great hall like a low drumbeat before a storm. Daughter of Nombula, granddaughter of Senil, we are here. The king, seated on his high carved throne, straightened at once. His hand, which had been idly tapping the armrest moments before, froze mid-motion. Even the guards shifted uneasily, their spears lowering just an inch as though bracing for something unseen. Amelie's eyes were no longer hers. Where there had once been the nervous flicker of a girl shamed before her people, there was now the still, unblinking gaze of something far older. The pupils seemed to expand and contract with a strange rhythm, catching the light like the surface of dark water at night. And then she began to speak. You accuse her, the voice intoned, turning its focus to the merchant who stood at the center of the court, his fine robes shimmering in the flicker of the fire pits. You say she cursed your harvest. You say her broken tongue is proof of witchcraft. But you, Lithando son of Bekail, what will you say of the seeds you buried beneath the moonlight? What will you say of the goats you stole from your neighbor's kraal? What will you say of the 3 boys who disappeared near your fields, whose bones now feed your soil? A gasp tore through the crowd. The merchant's face blanched, but his mouth moved quickly in protest. Lies, he shouted. The girl seeks to deceive the court with tricks. She, his voice faltered when Amelie's head turned slowly toward him again. "Do you think we do not see?" the voice asked, unhurried, unyielding. "Do you think your offerings to the river at midnight go unnoticed? The blood you pour was never yours to spill. You brought rot upon your own crops. You killed your brother's son to enrich your trade. And you dare to stand here, speaking of curses?" The murmuring in the hall grew wild, like dry leaves caught in a rising wind. Some clutched charms around their necks. Others moved backward, afraid to stand too close to Amelie, or rather, the thing that now inhabited her. The chief judge, who only moments ago had dared her to speak clearly if she can, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mocking grin had slipped from his face, replaced by a thin-lipped tightness that betrayed his unease. Amelie's body turned toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, like a hunter circling prey. The voice deepened further. "And you, Malusi son of Jwara, you sit in judgment of others while your own hands drip with the oil of bribes. How many widows have been forced to give you their daughters so their cases would be heard? How many empty bellies have you ignored in favor of full purses?" The judge's eyes darted to the king, but the king said nothing. His gaze was fixed on Amelie, as though seeing the invisible threads that bound her to the voices beyond the living. The voice in her chest grew stronger. "We remember. We have always remembered. We have walked these grounds long before your fathers' fathers drew their first breath. You think we are gone because you no longer pour the libations. You think we are deaf because you no longer call our names. But the ancestors hear. The ancestors see. And when the truth must rise, it will rise." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the carved wooden doors of the court. The fire pits hissed as the flames guttered low, then flared higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. It was as though the hall itself was bending toward her words. The merchant tried again to speak, but his voice came out cracked, trembling. This is trickery. She is possessed. Someone stop her." But no one moved. Even the guards, bound by oath to protect the king, seemed rooted in place. Their eyes darted between Amelie and the accusers, as though silently weighing which side was truly dangerous. Amelie's head tilted, listening to something beyond mortal ears. Her voice dropped to a whisper so low the court had to lean in to hear. "Luthando. Melissy. You will not see the next harvest." A collective shiver swept the room. The king finally rose, his cloak sweeping the floor like a wave of shadow. He stepped down from his throne and approached Amelie, stopping only when he was an arm's length away. The crowd held its breath, waiting for his judgment. "Who speaks through this child?" the king asked, his voice heavy but respectful. "We are the blood that bore her," the voice replied. "We are the ones you have forgotten. We are the keepers of your oaths, the watchers of your deeds. She is our mouth now, as her mother was before her, and as her daughter will be after." The king studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he turned to face the court. "Let the record show," he said, his voice ringing out, "that this accusation was false. Amelie is under the protection of the ancestors. To accuse her again without proof will be to accuse them. And that is a death none of you can escape." A roar of approval burst from some in the crowd, while others remained frozen in fear. The merchant staggered backward, his fine robes brushing the dusty floor as though they were suddenly too heavy to bear. The judge swallowed hard and bowed his head, sweat beading at his temples. Amelie's body swayed, her knees buckling. The deep voice softened. "Child, we are done." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Her eyes blinked rapidly, the light in them returning to the familiar, human warmth. But she looked pale, as though she had run for miles under the midday sun. The king signaled for her mother to come forward. Namvula rushed to her daughter, catching her just before she collapsed entirely. The crowd parted in silence as they carried her out, whispers following like the rustling of reeds along a riverbank. Behind them, in the shadow of the court, Luthando and Melusi stood still, pale, trembling, and knowing that the voices that had spoken that day did not make idle threats. And somewhere deep in Amelie's heart she could still feel it, the echo of that power, waiting for the moment it would be needed again. Amelie's last word had barely left her lips when the merchant's face drained of color. His hands trembled violently, the jeweled rings on his fingers clinking faintly as if announcing his downfall. His eyes darted around the court, to the king, to the crowd, to the heavy wooden doors as though measuring the distance to escape, but his knees buckled before he could take a step. He collapsed with a dull thud, his fine silk robe gathering in folds around him. The entire court froze. No one rushed to help him. I did it," he gasped, his voice raw and uneven. "I took the gold from the village treasury. I cheated the scales at the market. I lied to the king himself. A ripple of disbelief swept through the onlookers. Moments ago, the grand hall had been ringing with laughter at Amelie's expense. Now the air was so thick with tension it felt like it might suffocate them. People leaned in closer, straining to hear, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight. Amelie stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She didn't fully understand what had just happened. She could still feel that strange, thrumming energy inside her chest, like a drumbeat that didn't belong to her alone. It was as if the ancestors were still there, just behind her voice, watching. The merchant's words tumbled out faster, more desperate, as if dragged from his throat by invisible hands. I bribed the guards to look the other way. I stole from the offerings meant for the ancestors' shrine. His voice broke and he sobbed loudly, the sound echoing against the high ceiling. The chief judge, who had been grinning smugly moments before, now stood stiff, his face an unreadable mask. The king's gaze was fixed on the merchant, his jaw clenched, the lines on his face deepening. She cursed me, the merchant choked, pointing a trembling finger at Amelie. When she spoke, it was not her voice. It was them, the ones you pray to. They see everything. Whispers erupted in the court like a wind rushing through dry grass. The ancestors, she called the ancestors. The laughter from before had died entirely, replaced by murmurs tinged with fear. Some people stepped back from Amelie, as if merely standing too close might invite misfortune. Amelie swallowed hard, her palms damp. She wanted to say something, anything to explain, but the words stuck. She didn't feel cursed. She felt guided, protected. Yet the crowd's eyes on her were sharp, uncertain, and afraid. A woman near the front clutched the beaded necklace at her throat, murmuring a prayer under her breath. A man in the back crossed himself and muttered, "It's true. The ancestors have marked her. We laughed, and now they will punish us." The merchant, still on his knees, pressed his forehead to the floor. "Please, forgive me." His voice cracked with desperation. "I'll return it all. Every coin. Just make them stop." His words trembled on the edge of hysteria, and for a moment, Amelie almost felt pity for him. Almost. But in her mind's ear, she heard the deep, resonant voice that had spoken through her moments earlier. Truth must be spoken. Justice must be done. Two guards moved forward, seizing the merchant by the arms. He didn't resist, his body was limp, his head bowed. The sound of his jeweled bracelets clinking echoed in the silence. The king rose slowly from his seat, his presence heavy and commanding. "Take him to the holding cell," he ordered, his voice like stone grinding against stone. "He will face trial for every crime he has confessed to." The crowd erupted into a flurry of whispers again, this time tinged with awe and fear. The phrase, "Amelie's curse," passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire. Some avoided her eyes, others looked at her as though she were a living shrine, dangerous to touch but worthy of reverence. Amelie stood still, her breathing uneven. She could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her. She didn't plan to expose the merchant. She hadn't known she could. And yet, the truth had come out in a way no one could deny. Her gaze flicked toward the doors as the guards dragged the merchant away. Part of her wanted to flee the court, to escape the burning stares and whispered prayers. But another part, the part that had spoken with the voice of the ancestors, urged her to stand firm. This wasn't over. And as the chief judge shifted uneasily in his seat, refusing to meet her eyes, Amelie realized something. The merchant wasn't the only one with secrets. The king rose slowly from his carved ivory throne, his robes sweeping the marble floor with a sound like whispering wind. The hall, moments before alive with mocking laughter and then panicked murmurs, fell into an uneasy silence. Even the banners hanging high above seemed to sway less, as if the air itself had grown still in respect, or fear. His eyes, sharp and commanding, moved first to Amelie. They lingered there for a long moment, and in that moment, every person in the court realized the balance of power had shifted. This was no longer about a stuttering girl accused of dishonesty. This was about truth itself, summoned into the hall by a voice not of this world. Amelie stood in the center of the court, her hands still trembling slightly, though her eyes burned with a strange light. Moments earlier, the ancestors had spoken through her, deep, resonant words that seemed to come from a place beyond time. Now she was silent, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. Her gaze did not drop under the king's scrutiny. The same court that had mocked her for years now dared not meet her eyes. The merchant, once puffed with arrogance, was kneeling before the king, his forehead pressed to the floor, his voice shaking with desperate confessions. Every sentence he spoke painted his soul darker. Stolen grain meant for famine relief, bribes to secure trade rights, lies that ruined families. His words spilled like a river breaking a dam, and each one made the nobles around him flinch. His crimes had not just lined his pockets, they had sown hunger and grief across the land. And yet, he confessed them without being asked, as if some invisible force compelled him to pour out every hidden sin. Some swore they saw his hands trembling as if gripped by unseen spirits. The king raised one hand, and the merchant's words choked into silence. He did not look at the merchant at first but at the court itself. His counselors, his judges, the cluster of merchants and nobles who had filled the air with laughter at Amelie's expense not long ago. His voice when he spoke was low, but it carried to every corner of the room. "I have sat upon this throne for many seasons," he began, "and in those seasons, I have heard countless accusations and endless defenses. But never before have I heard the voice of our ancestors echo through these walls. Never have I seen truth strike a man's heart so swiftly that his own tongue turns against him." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some bowed their heads, others looked away. Amelie's heart pounded in her ears, unsure if his words were leading toward her vindication or her further humiliation. The king's gaze returned to her. "Amelie, daughter of Namasanto," he said, his voice softening slightly, "this court has wronged you. I have wronged you. We summoned you here to strip you of dignity, to entertain ourselves with your struggle, to let the powerful sharpen their cruelty on your spirit. But instead, you brought something into this hall that no one here could command or silence: the truth." He turned then to the chief judge, the one who had mocked her stutter so cruelly. "And you," the king said, his voice tightening, "you turned this court into a place of shame. You who should have upheld dignity, became the loudest voice of scorn. Tell me, judge, do you still laugh now?" The judge's face had gone pale, beads of sweat gathering on his brow. He bowed deeply, his voice trembling. "My king, But the king cut him off with a wave. "Silence. Your words are not needed. Your shame speaks louder." The king then turned his attention to the merchant. "You have confessed your crimes before the ancestors and before your people. You will return what you have stolen. You will give up your wealth to those you have harmed. And for the famine you worsened, you will spend the rest of your days serving in the public granaries, feeding those you left to starve. Should you refuse, know that the ancestors will not be the only ones who haunt you." The merchant collapsed further to the ground, nodding frantically. The hall was silent except for the king's steady breathing. Then he looked once more at Amelie and something in his face changed. His eyes, so often cold with the weight of rule, softened with something like respect. "Amelie," he said, "you have been called cursed, mocked for your voice, and treated as if you were less than the lowest servant. Yet today, you have shown that your voice carries more weight than any title, more truth than any oath sworn in this court." A murmur spread through the crowd, unsure of where this was leading. "I will not allow such a gift to be hidden away," the king continued. "From this day forward, you shall serve as the court's voice of truth. You will sit beside me when disputes are heard, and when the air in this hall grows thick with lies, you will speak, and the ancestors will speak through you. None will mock you here again, for to mock you will be to mock the truth itself." Amelie's breath caught in her chest. The words felt unreal, as if she might wake from a dream at any moment. She looked around and saw the same mouth that had laughed at her now pressed shut in shame. The same eyes that had rolled with mockery now watched her with something like fear, and perhaps reverence. The king stepped down from his throne and approached her. The sound of his sandals on the marble floor echoed in the stillness. When he stood before her, he placed a hand on her shoulder, not the condescending touch of a ruler to a subject, but the steady grip of someone sealing a pact. "You have endured more than most could bear, and yet you stand," he said. "I offer you this place not as charity but as honor." Amelie's lips parted, but she hesitated, afraid that if she spoke, her old stutter would return. But when she finally answered, her voice was steady. "I accept, my king." The crowd shifted again, this time not in discomfort but in reluctant acknowledgement. Even those who could not bring themselves to look her in the eye bowed their heads slightly as she passed. The king turned to the guards. "Escort the merchant to the dungeons until the arrangements for his punishment are made. And let it be known throughout the land that the court is no place for mockery of the innocent." As the guards dragged the merchant away, the heavy doors of the hall creaked open, letting in a gust of warm wind. Some swore they heard the faintest whisper in that wind, like the voices of the ancestors themselves, content that justice had been done. Amelie felt it brush against her cheek, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to smile. From that day on, no one in the kingdom spoke her name without respect. Children would whisper about the day the ancestors silenced the court's laughter. Merchants would think twice before twisting the truth. And Amelie, once mocked and doubted, became the steady flame that kept lies from taking root in the king's hall. But deep within her, she knew the truth of what had happened. It wasn't simply that the ancestors had chosen her voice, it was that they had been waiting for someone who would not bend, who would stand in the face of ridicule and still dare to speak. And though she now wore fine robes and sat near the throne, she carried herself the same way she had in the village, humble, watchful, and ready to speak when the world needed truth.